This week on Worldview, the BRICS Summit in Russia sets the stage for an icebreaker between Modi and Xi, as officials announced an agreement to resolve the 4-year-old military standoff at the line of actual control. Are there doubts about the détente, especially on issues like buffer zones? Also, what else did BRICS countries agree to at Kazan? Hello and welcome to Worldview at the Hindu with me, Suhasini Heather. Now, the big story this week really came on the back of the BRICS summits in Russia. At a briefing to discuss Prime Minister Narendra Modi's participation at the summit, which was held the briefing was in Delhi, Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri sprung this surprise on journalists.
Agreement has been arrived at on patrolling arrangements along the line of actual control in the India-China border areas, leading to disengagement and a resolution of the issues that had arisen in these areas in 2020.
Now, his announcement was dramatic and it was followed by a few hours later, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar saying this.
We have gone back to where the situation was in 2020, and we can say with that the disengagement process with China you can say has been completed. So
disengagement done, and a day later the Chinese side acknowledged what it called the progress in resolutions.
中印双方通过外交和军事渠道就中印边境的有关问题保持密切沟通。目前，双方已就有关问题达成解决方案，中方对此予以积极评价。下一步，中方将与印方落实好上述解决方案。关于你提到的双边会见。
Finally, one day later, Modi and Xi then held a formal bilateral meeting. So you can see what a busy week it's been. Why was this Modi and Xi meeting so important? Remember that this was the first bilateral meeting since 2019. And in 2019, remember, they had met twice in a row, a 2-day retreat in Mamallapuram, and then a meeting in Brasilia on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit there. Prior to the 2020 standoff, and remember that followed after China's transgressions at the line of actual control, massive mobilization, India's counter-mobilization, and then the clashes in Galwan. Prior to all of that, Modi and Xi had actually met 18 times in 5 years, between 2014 and 2019. So the fact that they hadn't met formally in the past 5 years that followed, really significant. During the standoff, they spoke twice informally on the sidelines of summits in Indonesia and South Africa. But India has consistently held that normal ties, including formal summit meetings, can only begin once the LAC standoff is resolved. So this is why that was significant. At the end of their meeting, here's what India and China have now announced. To begin with, patrolling will restart in the last 2 friction points. These are Depsang and Demchok. These were big holdouts for 2 years, and they'll go back now to 2020 levels. Remember, there's been disengagement already at 5 other friction points. There's been a 2-year impasse before we saw this outcome. But what were the other 5 friction points? Very quickly, if you have a map, I'll take you through them. One was, of course, at Galwan Valley. That happened straight after the clash in June 2020. Then in February 2021, the disengagement at Pangong So, at all the points around the lake where the soldiers were really eyeball to eyeball. And that disengagement came with a buffer zone being created, both sides apparently stepping back. At the same time, India agreed to step down from heights they had just recently claimed, a few months before that, what are called the Kailash Ridge Heights. And after the climb down, again, stepping back. Fourth was the Gogra post-August 2021. Now, the Gogra post goes up to what is called patrolling point 17A, and we saw disengagement there. We also saw the buffer zones coming in over there as well. And then there was the disengagement at Hot Springs in September of 2022 up to patrolling point 15, again with a buffer zone, after which the 2 sides were gridlocked. Neither side seemed to be willing to move ahead. So after 2 years, this is what they have agreed to. And what they also agreed to, if the first was the disengagement in Depsang and Demchok, They also agreed that this now ends the disengagement process, and they would now work towards the next steps, which are de-escalation, the thinning of troops, and de-induction, the pulling back of troops to possibly peacetime levels. The third thing they agreed to is Xi and Modi directing the special representatives, SRs as they're called, National Security Advisor Doval, and Wang Yi, who is not just foreign minister, he's also a senior member of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party and the special representative, to meet and then discuss the broader boundary dispute. They're to meet at an early date. They also directed foreign ministers Jaishankar and Wang Yi to meet soon to discuss restarting other mechanisms of dialogue and to quote-unquote rebuild ties. Finally, the next steps towards normalization of ties will also be taken up. That's what the Foreign Secretary said. So what are those steps very quickly that have been slowed down or suspended in the past 4 years and are likely now to be restarted, although we don't know when? One, travel links, direct flights were suspended due to COVID, but never resumed due to the border. So that's one thing to watch out for. There was a slowdown in issuance of visas for business persons, for students and others. Tourism has been virtually suspended between the two countries, even though the pandemic is long over. Journalists have been sent back from both Delhi and Beijing when both countries saw a lot of tensions. Only one Indian agency now remains, a media agency now remains in China. And fifth were the investment restrictions and special scrutiny of any Chinese investment in an Indian company above 25%. So then the question, is peace now breaking out between the world's two most populous nations? There are still more unanswered questions, so I'll take you through those. One question is, what steps or CBMs will the two armies now take to ensure that disengagement is permanent? For India, remember the terrain and the infrastructure makes it much longer to reinduct troops if that is needed in the future. So India has to factor that point in. Secondly, will buffer zones that were created in order to stabilize the border situation be dismantled now, or will they be maintained? And if those buffer zones remain, how can the government claim that they have restored pre-2020 levels of troops? The third question, how would India ensure that there isn't a repeat of what we saw in the Doklam disengagement of 2017, where after an agreement to disengage from the friction point itself, the PLA then went down and doubled down on infrastructure along the Doklam Plateau, turning the grasslands there into settled villages, bunkers, and helicopter bases. So a matter of concern for India. Fourth question, does India have clarity on what could have prompted the Chinese PLA's aggressive actions of April 2020? And if not, how can India be sure that it will not create a new such situation in the future? So those are important questions. It's necessary, while welcoming all of these moves, to also really take a look at what could be possible loopholes to watch out for in the future. The détente certainly rushed to a deadline for the BRICS Summit, proved that groupings like the BRICS are an important forum as they provide the venue for these kind of bilateral resolutions. So very quickly, because we're running out of time here, what are the other important takeaways from the summit in Kazan? One, with 10 BRICS leaders there, 13 countries joining as BRICS partners, about 40 others attending the outreach with the Global South that Putin hosted. The summit certainly proved that Mr. Putin and Russia are not isolated 2 years into the war with Ukraine. Secondly, the joint statement itself had 134 paragraphs that they all agreed on. That included a very strong statement and a criticism of Israel's military offensive on Gaza and the civilian casualties caused in the past year. Separate national positions, however, were maintained on the Russian war in Ukraine. The third, that BRICS focused on economic integration. And what do I mean by that? The use of BRICS national currencies, the BRICS Bank NDB getting a boost, the BRICS Interbank Cooperation Mechanism, the BRICS Grain Exchange, a cross-border payment system, and even a reinsurance company now all being talked about. And the fourth was a push for reform of financial architecture, that's the IMF and the World Bank, and global governance of the United Nations and the Security Council. And of course, this is something India has always been keen for BRICS to put on its agenda. The fifth was bilateral opportunities, including the introduction of Iran's new president, Pezeshkian. Amidst this West Asian crisis, he met with many leaders, including Prime Minister Modi, and of course, the main subject of this week, the India-China talks. So what's Worldview's take? The announcement that a resolution to the India-China military standoff since 2020 is in sight is no doubt a positive development and a win for diplomats negotiating the outcome. What's important from this point on is to see some transparency in the implementation of that resolution and complete vigilance and verification of actions on the ground by the two militaries. India has been burnt in the past before, so trust between two countries is the only guarantor of successful bilateral relations between them. Worldview recommendations time, and so many of these books I've spoken about before, but this is certainly one you should go back to now, called Understanding the India-China Border, The Enduring Threat of War in the High Himalayas by Manoj Joshi. It gives you the picture on the ground. The second is India and China at Odds in the Asian Century, a Diplomatic and Strategic History. This is by Vavpala Balachandran, a very senior official, and I haven't read it yet, but it looks very good. A third called Contested Lands, India, China and the Boundary Dispute by Maruf Raza, who's an expert on the field. Then there's some history books. One is called The India-China Boundary Problem, 1846 to 1947. So just looking at that 100-year period by A.G. Noorani, it's very important to read this and also to see the maps in particular there. The fifth is The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China, 1949 to 62. This is by former Ambassador Nirupama Rao. And The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, by former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to China, Vijay Gokhale. So I hope you enjoy reading them and do join us again here on Worldview from the team. Thanks for watching.